Chapter 2, The League of Nations and International Relations in the 1920s. This chapter considers the peace settlements of 1990 to 20 and the aims and motives of the participants. It assesses how effective these complex settlements were and what their impact, particularly on Europe and the Middle East, was. It also looks at the aims, structure, and record of the League of Nations in the 1920s. Why was there dissatisfaction with the peace settlements of 1919 to 1920? 2.1 Key terms and implications of the peace treaties: Versailles, Tryon, Neuilly, Saint-Germain, and Sèvres. In January 1919, the statesmen of the victorious powers were confronted with a Europe in turmoil. The sudden and complete defeat of the Central Powers had made Europe vulnerable to the spread of communism from Russia. For much of the winter of 1918 to 1919, Germany seemed poised on the edge of revolution. With the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, there was no stable government anywhere east of the Rhine. Further problems were caused by the influenza pandemic, which by the spring of 1919 had caused the deaths of millions of people, and by the near-famine conditions in Central and Eastern Europe. When the Paris Peace Conference opened, the delegations of 27 states, which included China, attended, but in reality, power lay with the Big Four: Britain, France, Italy, and the USA. Russia, convulsed by civil war, sent no delegates. The defeated states sent no representatives, which in Germany later gave rise to the bitter accusation that the Treaty of Versailles was a dictated peace. Aims of the victorious great powers. When the USA, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan gathered in Paris to draw up the peace terms with Germany, each power had its own set of aims and agenda. President Wilson of the USA was determined to ensure that the 14 points should be the basis for the coming peace negotiations, and to anchor the covenant of the League of Nations in the text of the peace treaties. Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, was painfully aware that France, with its reduced birth rate and a total number of casualties of 1.3 million dead and another 2.8 million wounded, faced a Germany which, as a consequence of the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the Tsar of Russia, was potentially stronger than in 1914. He therefore wanted to enforce maximum disarmament and reparation payments on the Germans, to set up a strong independent Polish, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslav states, and in addition an independent Rhineland state. He also wanted an alliance with Britain and the USA, and to continue inter-allied financial and economic cooperation into the post-war years. In contrast to France, Britain, even before the great powers met in Paris, had already achieved many of its aims. The German fleet had surrendered, German trade rivalry was no longer a threat, and Germany's colonial empire was liquidated. Britain's territorial ambitions lay in the Middle East, not Europe. Prime Minister Lloyd George also realized that a peaceful, united Germany would act as a barrier against the spread of Bolshevism from Russia. The logic of British policy pointed in the direction of a peace of reconciliation rather than revenge, but in two key areas, reparations and the question of German war guilt, Britain adopted a much harder line. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and Clemenceau agreed in December 1918 that the Kaiser should be tried by an international tribunal for war crimes. Under pressure from the Dominions, who also wanted a share of reparations, the British delegation at Paris was authorized to secure from Germany the greatest possible indemnity she can pay consistently with the well-being of British Empire and the peace of the world without involving an army of occupation in Germany for its collection. The Italian Prime Minister Orlando was anxious to convince the voters that Italy had done well out of the war, and concentrated initially on attempting to hold the Entente to the promises made in 1915 in the Treaty of London to give Italy the Austrian territories of South Tyrol and those along the Dalmatian coastline, as well as demanding the post of Fiume in the Adirondack. Japan's aims were limited to securing recognition of the territorial gains made in the war and having a racial equality clause inserted in the Covenant of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles, the settlement with Germany. All the peace settlements were to a greater or lesser extent the result of compromises between the Allied powers. Versailles was no exception. Its key clauses were the result of fiercely negotiated agreements, which were often reached only when the conference appeared to be on the verge of collapse. The first 26 articles, which appeared in all the other peace treaties as well, contained the Covenant of the League of Nations and were agreed unanimously. German war guilt. There was universal agreement among the victorious powers that Germany was guilty of having started the war. It was this principle of war guilt which was to provide the moral justification for the reparations clauses of the treaty, as was stressed in Article 231. Reparations. Although there was general agreement that Germany should pay reparations to the victors, there was considerable debate about the amount to be paid, the nature of the damage deserving compensation, and how Germany could raise such large amounts of money without rebuilding an export trade which might then harm the Allied industries. Essentially, the major issue behind the Allied demands was the compelling need to cover the cost of financing the war. Britain had covered 1/3 of the war expenditure through taxation. France just 1/6. At a time of severe social unrest, no Allied country could easily face the prospect of financing debts repayments by huge tax increases and savage cuts in expenditure. Initially, it was hoped that the USA could be pressured to continue wartime inter-Allied economic cooperation and, above all, cancel the repayment of Allied war debts, but by the end of 1918, it was obvious that this was not going to happen, as Wilson had dissolved all the agencies for inter-Allied cooperations in Washington. French demands for reparations. The French finance minister, Louis Clottes, backed by the press and the Chamber of Deputies, urged a policy of maximum claims and coined the slogan, "Germany will pay for everything." Behind the scenes, however, Leuchter, the Minister for Reconstruction, pursued a more subtle policy and informed the Germans that such was the need of the French economy for an immediate injection of cash. His government would settle for a more moderate sum which the Germans would be able to raise quickly through the sale of bonds on the world's financial markets. The German government, however, suspected that these overturns were merely a means of dividing Germany from the USA, which was seen in Berlin as the country potentially most sympathetic to the German cause. The USA's reparation policy was certainly more moderate than either Britain's or France's, as it recommended that a modest fixed sum should be written into the treaty. British reparation demands. The British delegation consistently maximized their country's reparation claims on Germany. Some historians explain that this in terms of the pressure exerted on the government by the electorate. On the other hand, Lloyd George himself claimed that the imposition of a high indemnity would prevent the Germans spending money on an army. It was arguable that a high indemnity would also ensure that there would be money left over for Britain and the Dominions after France and Belgium had claimed their share. To safeguard Britain's percentage of reparations, the Imperial War Cabinet urged that the cost of the war pensions should be included in the reparation bill. By threatening to walk out of the conference, Lloyd George then forced the Council of Four to support his arguments. Later, as reparation debts appeared to paralyze the German economy and prevent a global economic recovery, Lloyd George was to have second thoughts about reparations. Setting up Reparation Commission. The British pension claims made it even more difficult for the Allied financial experts to agree on an overall figure for reparations. Consequently, at the end of April, it was agreed, much to the anger of the Germans, that the Reparation Commission should be set up to assess in detail by May 1st, 1921. What the German economy could afford in the meantime. The Germans would make an interim payment of 20 billion gold marks and a raise of further 60 million through billion the sale of bonds. It was not until December 1919 that Britain and France agreed that Britain should receive 25% of the total amount of reparations to be paid by Germany, while France would have 55%. Belgium was the only power to be awarded full compensation for its losses and priority in payment of the first sums due from Germany, largely because it too had threatened to withdraw from the conference in May at a time when Italy had already walked out and the Japanese were also threatening to do so. German disarmament. The Allies and the USA agreed on a necessity for German disarmament, but there were differences in emphasis. The British and Americans wished to destroy in Germany the tradition of conscription, which they regarded as the cause of militarism. Instead, they wanted a small professional army created along the lines of the British or USA peacetime armies. General Foch, more wisely as it turned out, feared that a professional German army would merely become a tightly organized nucleus of trained men which would be capable of quick expansion when the opportunity arose. Foch was overruled, and the Council of Ten accepted in March proposals for the creation of inter-allied commissions to monitor the pace of German disarmament, the abolition of general staff, the creation of a regular army with a maximum strength of 10,000 men, the dissolution of the German Air Force, and the reduction of its navy to a handful of ships. The territorial sentiment. France wished to use every opportunity to weaken Germany by taking territory away from it, while Britain sought to preserve a united and democratic Germany as a counter to Bolshevik Russia. The USA also hoped to achieve a fair settlement along the lines of the 14 points, but supported ceding German territory to Poland, France, and Belgium, where the majority of the population was Polish, French, or Belgian. In the end, the territorial clauses in the treaty were an uneasy compromise. Initially, Upper Silesia was most of the provinces of West Prussia and Posen were awarded to Poland, and northern Schleswig was to be returned to Denmark. Thanks to pressure from Lloyd George, there was to be a plebiscite in Marienwetter, and Dosing, a city surrounded by a Polish population, was to become a free city under the protection of the League of Nations. Along Germany's western borders, there was a consensus among the victorious powers that Alsace-Lorraine, which Germany had annexed after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, should revert to France. Eupen and Maldi ceded to Belgium, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg declared neutral. The future of the Saarland proved more controversial. It was ethnically German, but Clemenceau insisted on the restoration to France of that part of the Saar, which was given to Prussia in 1814. He also aimed to detach the mineral and industrial basin to the north, which had never been French, and place it under an independent non-German administration. Finally, he demanded full French ownership of the Saar coal mines to compensate for the destruction of the pits in northern France by the Germans. Wilson immediately perceived that there was a clash between the national interests of France and the principle of self-determination as enshrined in the 14 points. While he was ready to agree to French access to the coal mines until the production of their own coal mines had been restored, he vetoed outright other demands. To save the conference from breaking down, Lloyd George persuaded Wilson and Clemenceau to accept a compromise whereby the mines would become French for 15 years, while the actual government of the Saar would be entrusted to the League. After 15 years, the people would have the right to decide in a plebiscite whether they wished to return to German rule. In 1935, the plebiscite was duly held, and the territory reverted to German control. Over the future of the Rhineland, there was an equally bitter clash between Britain and France. The British had no ambitions on the Rhine, but to the French, the occupation of the Rhine was a unique opportunity to weaken Germany prematurely by creating an independent Rhineland state that would look to Paris rather than Berlin. The British feared that this would merely sow the seeds of another war by creating a permanent source of tension between France and Germany. After heated, bitter arguments, Clemenceau agreed that the Rhineland, which was to be divided into 3 zones, was to be occupied for a period of 15 years by Allied troops as a guarantee of the execution of the treaty. Each zone was in turn to be evacuated after 5, 10, and 15 years, and thereafter the Rhine was to remain demilitarized. Clemenceau was persuaded to agree to this by the offer of an Anglo-US military treaty guaranteeing France against any future German attack. Germany's colonies. In May, agreement was reached on the division of the German colonies. Germany, as a defeated power judged to be guilty of starting the war, was no longer to be trusted as a colonial power. In reality, of course, the victors wanted to keep their colonial conquests. Britain, France, and the Dominion of South Africa were allocated most of the former German colonial empire in Africa, while Australia, New Zealand, and Japan secured the scattered German possessions in the Pacific. Italy was awarded control of the Juba Valley in East Africa, and a few minor territorial adjustments were made to its Libyan frontier with Algeria. Essentially, Britain, the Dominions, and France had secured what they wanted, despite on President Wilson's insistence paying lip service to the League by agreeing to mandated status for the former German colonies, Japan and former German territory in Shandong. A serious clash arose between Japan and the USA over the former German concessions in China. The Japanese were determined to hold on to the ex-German leasehold territory in Shandong, which they had seized in 1914. The Chinese government, however, on the strength of its declaration of war against Germany in 1917, argued that all former German rights should automatically revert to the Chinese state, despite the fact that in 1950 it had agreed to recognize Japanese rights in Shandong. Wilson was anxious to block the growth of Japanese influence in the Pacific and supported China, but Lloyd George and Clemenceau, wanting to protect their own rights in China, backed Japan. A compromise was agreed whereby Japan promised verbally only that Chinese control would be restored by 1922. Wilson already locked in conflict with the Italians over their claims to Fiume, and facing Japanese threats to boycott the conference and sign a separate peace with Germany, had no option but to concede. It is arguable that this humiliating defeat did much to turn the U.S. Senate against the Treaty of Versailles. The Shandong decision outraged China and triggered widespread riots and strikes. In June, the Chinese government refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Presentation on the draft terms to Germany. On May 7th, the draft peace terms of the treaty were at last presented to the Germans, who were given a mere 15 days to draw up their reply. The German government bitterly criticized the treaty on the basis that it did not conform to the 14 points and demanded significant concessions: immediate membership of the League of Nations, from which Germany had been excluded, a guarantee that Austria and the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, which was a part of the new Czechoslovakia state, should have the chance to decide whether they wished to join Germany, the setting up of a neutral commission to examine the war guilt question, Allied and U.S. concessions. Although these demands were not accepted, Lloyd George, fearful that the Germans might reject the treaty, persuaded the French to agree to a plebiscite in Upper Silesia. He failed to limit the Rhineland occupation to 5 years, but did manage to secure the vague assurance which later became Article 431 of the treaty, that once Germany had given concrete evidence of her willingness to fulfill her obligations, the Allied and associated powers would consider an earlier termination of the period of occupation. The signature of the Treaty of Versailles and the German reaction. On June 16th, the Germans were handed the final version of the treaty, incorporating these concessions. Not surprisingly, given the depth of opposition to it among the German people, it triggered a political crisis that split the cabinet and led to the resignation of the Chancellor. Yet, in view of its own military weakness and the continuing Allied blockade, the Berlin government had little option but to accept the treaty, although it made it very clear that it was acting under duress. On June 28, 1919, the treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where in 1871 the German Empire had been proclaimed. The resentment of the German people. Although historians such as Margaret Macmillan and Niall Ferguson argue that the Treaty of Versailles was less harsh than its critics have claimed, it was nevertheless a deeply traumatic blow to the Germans of all clauses and political parties. They particularly resented in what they perceived to be a dictated peace: the war guilt clause, the burden of reparations, which were considered punitive and savage and would burden the German economy for generations to come. The loss of land in East Germany to the Poles was also deeply resented, as the Poles were seen by German nationalists as people of a lower civilization. The occupation of the Rhineland, particularly in the French zone, by French colonial troops from West Africa and Indochina, which was regarded as a deep humiliation, although after 1924 the Dawes and Young plans eased the burden of reparations, and in 1930 Britain and France evacuated the Rhineland, Versailles remained a symbol of national humiliation for Britain, which Hitler was to exploit. The peace treaties with Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria. After the ceremony at Versailles, the Allied leaders returned home, leaving their officials to draft the treaties with Germany's former allies. The three defeated powers, Austria and Hungary, both treated as the heirs to the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Bulgaria, all had to pay large sums of reparations, almost totally disarm and submit to the humiliation of a war guilt clause. The basis of the settlement in South Central Europe and the Balkans was the creation of the Czechoslovak state and Serbo-Croat Slovene state of Yugoslavia as it became known. The Treaty of Saint-Germain in September 10th, 1919. The Treaty of Saint-Germain split up the diverse territories which before the war had been part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rump Austria was now reduced to a small German-speaking state of some 6 million people. Italy was awarded South Tyrol, despite the existence there of some 230,000 people of German ethnic origin. Bohemia and Moravia were ceded to Czechoslovakia. Any second thoughts the British or Americans had against handing over the Czechs, the 3 million Germans who made up nearly 1/3 of the population of these provinces, were quickly stifled by French opposition. The French wanted a potential ally against Germany to be strengthened by a defensible frontier, and the position of the Skoda munitions works in Pleisen, both of which entailed the forcible interrogation of large German minorities into Czechoslovakia. Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Baltima were handed over to Yugoslavia. Galicia and Bukovina were ceded to Poland and Romania, respectively. Only in Carthia, where the population consisted of German-speaking Slovene people who did not want to join Yugoslavia, did the great powers consent to a plebiscite. This resulted in 1920 in the area remaining Austrian. To avoid the dangers of an enchilance, with Germany, Article 88, which was identical to Article 80 in the Treaty of Versailles, stated that only the Council of the League of Nations was empowered to sanction a change in Austria's status as an independent state. Effectively, this meant that France, as a permanent member of the Council, could veto any proposed change. The Treaty of Trianon, June 4, 1920. Of all the defeated powers in 1919, it is arguable that Hungary suffered the most severely by the Treaty of Trianon. Hungary lost over 2/3 of its territory, 41.6% of its population. It was particularly vulnerable to partition, as essentially only the heartlands of Hungary and the Great Central Plain were Magyar, ethnically Hungarian. Its fate was sealed when, in November 1918, Serb, Czechs, and Romanian troops all occupied the regions they claimed. The negotiation of the treaty was delayed by the communist coup in March 1919, but was resumed after its defeat. The Treaty of Trianon was signed in June 1920. Most of the German-speaking areas in the west of the former Hungarian state was ceded to Austria. The Slovakian Ruthenian regions in the north went to Czechoslovakia, the east went to Romania, the south went to Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Neuilly, November 27, 1919. Essentially, Britain and France regarded Bulgaria as the Balkan Prussia, which needed to be restrained, and were determined, despite reservations from Italy and the USA, to reward their allies Romania, Greece, and Siberia, by then part of Yugoslavia, as its expense. Thus, southern Dubor, with a mere 7,000 Romanians out of a total population of 250,000, was ceded to Romania, and western Thrace, which was provided Bulgarian access to the Aegean, was given to Greece. The reaction of Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria to the peace treaties. The immediate reaction to the peace terms in all three countries was a sense of shock and betrayal. One left-wing Austrian newspaper declared that never has the substance of a treaty of peace so grossly betrayed the intentions which were to have guided its construction, as is the case with this treaty. The Australians were bitterly disappointed by Article 80, which prevented the Entente with Germany, and the Hungarians, in the words of the historian Margaret Macmillan, writing in 2001, Tryon became shorthand for Allied cruelty, and its memories fueled an almost universal desire to undo its provinces. Until the end of the Second World War, the overriding aim to the Hungarian government was to regain the lost territories. In Bulgaria, there was initially among the nationalists and the army talk of resistance, but the Prime Minister, Alexander Stambovskiy, accepted the new frontiers and rejected the expansionist policies of the past. Even coming to terms with Yugoslavia, he believed that the treaty could in time be changed peacefully, and he also wanted to turn his attention to internal reform. The settlement with Turkey, 1919 to 1923. The Treaty of Sèvres. The Treaty of Sèvres, which was signed in August 1920, was another Anglo-French compromise. Lloyd George hoped to weaken Turkey not only by deprivating it of the Constantinople and of control of the Straits, but also by forcing it to surrender all territories where there was no ethnic Turkish majority. He now investigated Greece, which had entered the war on the Turkish power, and in effect on the Allied side in 1917, rather than Italy, filling the vacuum left by the collapse of Turkish power and in effect becoming the agent of the British Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. The French, on the other hand, concerned to protect their pre-war investments in Turkey, wished to preserve a viable Turkish state. Above all, they wanted the Turkish government to remain in Constantinople, where it would be more vulnerable to French pressure. The end product of this Anglo-French compromise was a harsh and humiliating treaty. Constantinople remained Turkish, but Thrace and most of the European coastline of the Sea of Marmara and the Dardanelles were to go to Greece. In the Samaria region of the Greeks were also given responsibility for internal administration and defense, while an Armenian state was to be set up with access across Turkish territory to the Black Sea. The Straits were to be controlled by an international commission, and an Allied financial committee was to have the right to inspect Turkey's finances by separate agreement. Zones were also awarded to France and Italy in southern Turkey. The division of Turkey Arabian state territories. In May 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. By this, they committed themselves up to dividing the Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Lebanon into Anglo-French spheres of interest. Once the war against Turkey had been won, Britain, however, was the only power with a large army in the Middle East, and consequently was able to revise the agreement unilaterally. In 1917, Britain insisted on claiming the whole of Palestine, which was quite contrary to the agreement, by announcing support for the Zionist ambition to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. Britain cleverly managed to secure the USA's backing for its aims. In February 1919, in defense to Wilson and the 14 points, Britain and France agreed that they could only exercise power over these territories in the name of the League of Nations. It took several more months of bitter argument before the British agreed to a French mandate in Syria and also French access to the oil wells in Mosul in Iraq. The frontiers between the British mandates of Palestine and Iraq and the French mandate of Syria were finalized in December. The Turkish reaction. When the Allies imposed the Treaty of Sèvres, they took little account of the profound changes in Turkey brought about by the rise of Mustafa Kemal, the leader of the new Turkish nationalism. Kemal had set up a rebel government in Ankara in March 1920 and was determined not to accept the treaty. The long delay until August 1920 ensured that growing Turkish resentment, particularly at the Greek occupation of Samaria in May 1919, and advanced into the Anatolian interior, which the Allies had encouraged, made it enforce enforcement increasingly difficult. The reactions of the victors to the peace treaties. While the defeated powers deeply resented the peace treaties imposed upon them, the victors too were critical of many aspects of the treaties. The reason for this was that the treaties were compromises in which no power achieved all they wanted. Britain and France. Neither power received all it hoped for. French public opinion was convinced that France, particularly in agreements covering the Rhineland disarmament and Eastern Europe, had not secured the necessary terms to guarantee its future safety. For this, the French blamed the naive idealism of Britain and the USA. The British, on the other hand, believed the French stubbornness had prevented the negotiation of a moderate and lasting peace. Over the next 5 years, both countries would attempt to bend the treaties to their wishes. The USA. By January 1920, the treaty had been ratified by all the signatory powers, with the important exception of the USA. In Washington, crucial amendments had been put forward by a coalition of isolationists led by Senator Onge, rejecting the Shandong settlement with Japan and seriously modifying the Covenant of the League of Nations. In essence, the isolationists feared that if the USA joined the League, it could be committed to defend the independence of other League members from aggression, even if this meant going to the war. They therefore proposed that Congress should be empowered to veto U.S. participation in any League initiative that clashed with the USA's traditional policy of isolationism and independence. Wilson felt that these amendments would paralyze the League and so refused to accept them. He failed twice to secure the necessary 2/3 majority in the Senate. The consequences of this defeat for Europe were serious. Without U.S. ratification, the Anglo-American military guarantee of France lapsed, and the burden of carrying out the Treaty of Versailles fell on Britain and France. Italy. Despite Italian gains in the South Trial, the peace treaties were regarded by many Italian nationalists as a mutilated victory. The Italians had suffered high casualties and not been awarded what they had been promised by the Treaty of London in 1915. The Italian Prime Minister Orlando was desperate to prove to the Italian electorate that Italy was not a proletarian nation which could be dictated to by the great powers. In the Adriatic, Italy had claimed Istria and Dalmatia and insisted also on its right to annex the port of Fiume, in which there was a bare majority of ethnic Italians. However, President Wilson, after compromising over the Tsar in Shandong, was stubbornly determined to make a stand on the 14 points in the Adriatic. Orlando and Simonio, his foreign secretary, walked out of the peace conference in protest and did not return until May 9, 1919. It was not until November 1920 that Yugoslavia and Italy agreed on a compromise and signed on the Treaty of Rapallo. Istria was partitioned between the two powers. Fiume was to become a self-governing free state, while the rest of Dalmatia went to Yugoslavia. Japan. Although the Japanese gained much of what they wanted in the Versailles Treaty, it was viewed with mixed feelings in Japan. The failure to gain a clause in the Covenant of the League of Nations guaranteeing racial equality, which was blocked by Britain and the USA, was seen as a great humiliation by all political parties in Japan, and contributed to the suspicion that Britain and the USA were in reality intent on controlling Japanese power in East Asia. Problems in successor states created by post-war settlements. With the particular exception of Czechoslovakia, the successor states were fragile and vulnerable. Czechoslovakia had an industrial base in a stable democratic government. On the other hand, its frontiers were artificial, and the state was composed of two historic but very different areas: the Czechs' land, Bohemia and Moravia, and Slovakia. The Slovaks rapidly came to resent what they had believed to be the domination of the Peru government by the Czechs. There was also a large German majority in the Sudetenland, which in 1930 numbered 22.3% of the population. In 1930, it increasingly looked to Nazi Germany for protection and ultimately provide Hitler with the excuse to annex the Sudetenland. Poland. In response to Polish attempts to annex Ukraine in 1920, which had in the 16th and 17th century been controlled by Poland. Soviet Russia invaded Poland only after the Red Armies was decisively defeated in the Battle of Warsaw in 1920 was it possible to determine Poland's eastern frontiers by the Treaty of Riga. Poland annexed a considerable area of Burussia and western Ukraine, and all of which lay well to east of the frontier, which had been proposed in 1919. The so-called Cruisen Line, the western frontiers with Germany, were defined by the plebiscites of 1921 in Upper Silesia, Marwetter, and Allenstein, but some 700,000 Germans continued to live, for the most part unwillingly, within the new Polish frontiers, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. The Allies in the USA also recognized the independence of Armenia, Georgia, and something, which in the power vacuum created by the defeat of Turkey in the Russian Revolution and Civil War had managed to establish a fragile independence. However, with the victory of the Bolsheviks and the revival of Turkey under Maestros Kemal in 1923, these states were rapidly lost their independence. Successor states to Austria-Hungary. In their efforts to create homogeneous nation-states out of former Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the victorious states faced almost impossible problems, as the populations of these states were ethnically very diverse and had been scattered throughout the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. In March 1919, the communists temporarily seized control of Hungary and were defeated by the intervention of Romanian troops. In Yugoslavia, there was tension and often clashes between the Serbs and Croats, while the Treaty of Trianon ensured that 3 million Hungarians suddenly found that they lived in Romania, Yugoslavia, or Slovakia. In Romania, the Hungarians were discriminated against despite the minority treaty in Cluj, the former capital of Transylvania. For instance, the Hungarian university was closed down and the professors and students dispersed. In an age of heightened nationalism, these minorities were often viewed with suspicion in their new countries, and in turn, minorities still held passionate loyalties to their homeland. Integrating the often hostile minorities in the successor states was made more difficult by the way the peace treaties disrupted Eastern Europe as an economic and political unit. In the words of the historian Peter Hank, 1992, the peace treaties blocked centuries-old commercial routes and broke off time-tested and fruitile economic relations. That was made worse by inflation and mounting post-war economic and political chaos. In 1922, both Austria and Hungary seemed on the verge of economic collapse and were saved only by the intervention of the League of Nations, which arranged international loans and advised on a programme of financial reform. How and why did international tensions remain high in the period of 1920 to 1923? 2.2. Crises and tensions 1920 to 1923. In 1920, Britain and France faced the most complex set of problems in Europe, which all helped keep international tensions high during the years 1920 to 23. They had to ensure that Germany and its allies carried out the peace treaties, finalize the frontiers of Poland and other successor states, deal with the crises caused by Italian ambitions in the Adriatic, respond to the threat to the Treaty of Sèvres posed by cooperation between Bolshevik Russia and resurgent Turkey under Kemal. All this had to be carried out without the assistance of the USA, which had not ratified the peace treaties and increasingly pursued a policy of neutrality. International tensions caused by attempts to carry out the Treaty of Versailles, 1920 to 1923. Once the Treaty of Versailles had been ratified, the victorious powers set up a series of inter-allied commissions to organize the plebiscites, monitor German disarmament, and examine Germany's financial position with a view to payment of its reparations. These reported to the Conference of Ambassadors in Paris, which represented the Allied powers, but the real decisions were taken by the Allied prime ministers who, between January 1920 and January 1924, met 24 times to review progress made in carrying out the Treaty of Versailles and other peace treaties, continuing Anglo-French differences over Germany. Both Britain and France had conflicting ideas of how best to ensure that Germany carried out the Treaty of Versailles. Essentially, Britain, as the center of a worldwide empire, wanted to see a balance of power in Europe that would prevent either French or German domination and lead to it free to deal with the growing challenges to its power from nationalist movements in India, Egypt, and Ireland. Britain was also convinced that only a prosperous and peaceful Germany could pay reparations and play its part in Europe as one of the main engines of the European economy. For France, the German problem was an overriding priority. French policy swung uneasily between occasionally exploring the possibilities of economic cooperation with Germany and more usually of applying forceful measures designed prematurely to weaken Germany and to force it to fulfill the treaty. Poland and Germany. For the French, it was imperative to ensure that the new Polish state was strong enough to help contain a resurgent Germany. The French, therefore, worked to ensure that it secured as much territory as possible from Germany. The British, on the other hand, were convinced that this would only store up problems for the future, as it would embitter those Germans who would have to reside in the new Polish state and make Germany more determined to regain the territory it had lost to Poland. The crisis in Upper Silesia, the plebiscite of March 1921. By the end of the 1920s, the Meriwether and Allenstein plebiscites had been held, in both of which the population voted to stay in Germany, and Dusing had become a free city under the administration of the League of Nations in November 1920. Fixing the Upper Sicilian frontiers, however, proved to be a much greater problem. Upper Silesia had a population of some 2,280,000 Germans and Poles, who were bitterly divided among ethnic lines, and a concentration of coal mines and industries that were second only in size to the Ruhr. The plebiscite on March 17, 1921, produced an ambiguous result which did not solve the Anglo-French disagreement over Poland. The British argued that its result justified keeping the key industrial regions of the province German, while the French insisted that they should be awarded to Poland, fearing that once again British wishes would prevail. The Poles seized control of the industrial area, which was still legally German, and an uprising broke out in May 1921. By threatening to occupy the Ruhr, the French stopped the Germans from intervening, and order was eventually restored by British and French troops in July 1921. As a result of insoluble Anglo-French disagreements, the whole question of Silesia borders was handed over to the League of Nations in August. Germany and the reparation crisis, 1920 to 1923. It was, however, the reparation question that caused most international tensions. At the end of April 1921, the Reparation Commission at last fixed a global total for reparations of 132 billion gold marks to be paid over a period of 42 years. When this was rejected by Germany on the grounds that the sum was too high, an ultimatum was dispatched to Berlin, giving the Germans only a week to accept the new payment schedule, after which the Ruhr would be occupied. To carry out the London ultimatum, a new government was formed in the Joseph Worth on May 10th. Assisted by Walter Rathenau, his Minister for Reconstruction, he was determined to pursue a policy of negotiation rather than confrontation. The first installment was paid, and Rathenau made some progress in persuading the French government to accept the payment of a proportion of reparations in the form of the delivery of industrial goods and coal, but opposition from German industrialists prevented this plan from being implemented. By the end of the year, the German government dropped a bombshell by announcing that, as a consequence of escalating inflation, it could not raise sufficient hard currency to meet the next installment of reparation payments. The Ruhr crisis and German hyperinflation, 1923 to 1924. With the failure of the Genoa Conference in April to find a solution to the reparation problem, a major confrontation between France and Germany was now seemed inevitable. In July, the German government requested a 3-year moratorium. At the same time, Britain announced that as the USA was demanding the repayment of British wartime debts, it must in turn insist on the repayment of money loaned to former allies, particularly France. To the French, Britain's demand for those repayments contrasted painfully with the concessions Lloyd George was ready to offer the Germans. On November 27, 1922, the French cabinet decided finally that the occupation of the Ruhr and the seizure of its coal mines and key factories as productive pledges were the only means of forcing Germany to pay reparations, and on January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops moved into the Ruhr. Significantly, Britain did not join in the adopted policy of a benevolent passivity towards France. In the opinion of the London Times, something as far-reaching in its effects as the declaration of war in 1914 or the conclusion of the armistice had occurred. Had Germany had the strength, French troops would have been repulsed by force, but Germany was virtually disarmed, and so for 9 months the French occupation of the Ruhr was met by passive resistance and strikes by the German workers, which were financed by the German government. German hyperinflation. Passive resistance certainly hindered French operations in the Ruhr and raised international tensions still higher, but it also triggered hyperinflation in Germany. To subsidize the strikes, compensate for the lost tax revenues from the Ruhr, the government printed even larger sums of money. The value of the German mark continued to sink rapidly, and by August it was worthless. From 4.2 marks to the dollar in July 1914, it had risen to a bunch of money. 42, a bunch of money. By November 15th, 1923. This 9 zeros, a bunch of money, like a billion zeros. This completed the impoverishment of the large number of the middle class who were dependent on fixed incomes and war bonds and pensions. The end of passive resistance. In September, Germany was on the brink of economic collapse, and the new chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, called off passive resistance. The cost of the occupation also seriously weakened the French franc. France's attempts to back Rhineland separationism and to create an independent Rhineland currency were unsuccessful. Separationist leaders were assassinated by German nationalist agents from unoccupied Germany or licensed by angry crowds. Poincaré, the French prime minister, had little option but to accept an American initiative for setting up a commission chaired by the USA financier Charles G. Dawes. 2 committees of experts, one to study Germany's capacity for payment and the other to advise on how it could best balance the budget and restore its currency, began work in 1924. Its recommendations were discussed below. International tensions in the Adriatic, the Fiume and Corfu crises. Italian disappointment with the peace treaties led to both the Fiume and Corfu crises. The latter crisis was a major challenge to the authority of the League of Nations. Both crises ended in compromises, but showed the power of nationalism in post-war Italy. The Fiume crisis. Italy was intent on making the Adriatic an Italian sea by acquiring not only the Trieste, but also northern Dalmatia, the port of Fiume, and the city of Vlorë on the Albanian coast. These claims were rejected by President Wilson, but a compromise seemed possible, where Prime Minister Orlando was replaced by Franco Nitti in June 1919. However, the lynching of 9 French troops in Fiume by an Italian mob in July, and then the seizure of the city in September by the Italian nationalist poet Dionysio, prevented any settlement and increased the international tension. It was not until November 1920 that Yugoslavia and Italy agreed on a compromise and signed the Treaty of Rapallo. Istria was partitioned between the two powers. Fiume was to become a self-governing free city, while the rest of Dalmatia went to Yugoslavia. In December, Italian troops enforced the treaty by clearing D'Annunzio and his supporters out of Fiume. The Corfu Crisis of 1923. In October 1922, the fascist politician Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy and gave fresh impetus to Italian nationalism. On August 27, 1923, an Italian general and his staff, who were part of an Allied team democrating the new Albanian frontiers, were ambushed and likely by Greek bandits near the Albanian frontier. Mussolini immediately seized the chance to issue a deliberately unacceptable ultimatum to Athens. When the Greeks rejected three of its demands, Italian troops occupied Corfu, thereby escalating international tensions. The Greeks wanted the League to intervene, but bowed to French and Italian pressure to have the incident referred to the Conference of Ambassadors. The conference, while initially accepting some assistance from the League, ultimately settled the case itself and insisted that Greece should pay 50 million lira in compensation to Italy. The Schnock Crisis, September 1922. The growing crisis in Turkey also contributed to international tensions. By December 1921, it was becoming clear that the Treaty of Sèvres was no longer viable. After settling the dispute over the Russo-Turkish frontier and the Caucasus with Russia, Kemal was able to concentrate his forces against the Greeks in Samaria, without fear of Russian intervention from the north. By August 1922, having routed the Greeks, he was poised to enter the Constantinople and the Straits Zone, which were still occupied by Allied troops. Both the Italians and French rapidly withdrew, leaving the British isolated. Poincaré rejected outright Lord Curzon's appeal for diplomatic support, and the British dominions were also not prepared to provide assistance. On September 22nd, Kemal sent a detachment of troops to the Schnock in the neutral zone between the British and Turkish forces. The cabinet in London sent General Hartington, the British commander, an ultimatum to deliver to Kemal, demanding their withdrawals. War between British and Kemal's forces was now a very real possibility. The situation was all the more dangerous because Kemal would have been backed by the USSR. However, Hartington wisely did not deliver the ultimatum, and Kemal was able to avoid direct confrontation with the British forces. Instead, both sides negotiated on October 11th the Armistice of Mydanya, which gave Kemal virtually all he wanted. The Greeks withdrew from eastern Thrace and Adrianople, and the British recognized Turkish control over the Constantinople and the Straits. The Treaty of Sèvres was now dead, and a new settlement with Turkey was to be negotiated at Lausanne. Aims and impact of international treaties and conferences. The post-war world and the years 1921 to 1923 faced numerous problems, as we have seen above, which increased international tensions. The First World War had decisively weakened the power of the European states. Yet as the very point when the USA had become the financial center of the world and potentially its strongest military power, the USA had retreated into what Professor Heinebrand calls Fortress America, and focused primarily on its regional interests in East Asia, the Caribbean, and South America. At the same time, Bolshevik Russia, or the USSR, had emerged victorious from the Civil War, but was isolated and faced a hostile Western world. Japan remained a regional power, mainly concerned with increasing its influence in China. China itself was in chaos, and the government was appointed by whichever warlord was temporarily in control of Beijing. Between 1916 and 1928, there were 26 prime ministers. Britain and France faced the task of implementing the peace treaties in Europe, and the Middle East virtually alone. United, both states might just have been successful, but they each pursued rival aims and were deeply distrustful of each other. Without the unity of the great powers, attempts to restore peace and prosperity in such a fragmented world were difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, at Washington, Genoa, and Lausanne, efforts were made to reduce international tensions. The Washington and Lausanne conferences achieved real but limited success, while most ambitious aims of the Genoa Conference ended in failure and ultimately led to the occupation of the Ruhr. The Washington Conference. The Washington Conference of 1921 was one of the key post-war conferences and indicated the shape U.S. policy was to take in the 1920s. The USA refused to join the League, but it was willing to play a major role in promoting disarmament and post-war financial stability. At Washington, its main achievement was to stop a dangerous arms race developing between Britain, the USA, Japan, and to improve U.S.-Japanese relations. Naval disarmament and the future of the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902. By 1920, the USA was alarmed by the rise of Japanese power in the Pacific. Japan, already possessing the third largest navy in the world, had begun a major naval construction programme. The USA responded by embarking on their own formidable building programme, which, when completed, would make the USA Navy the largest in the world. In turn, this pushed Britain in the early 1921 into announcing its own naval programme, but privately it told Washington that it desired a negotiated settlement as it could not afford a naval race. President Harding would only negotiate with Britain if it agreed to terminate the 20-year-old Anglo-Japanese alliance, which theoretically at least could have involved Britain as Japan's ally in a war against the USA. As the treaty was due for renewal in July 1921, the British and Japanese agreed under pressure from Washington to replace it with a new four-power treaty which committed Britain, France, Japan, and the USA to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific and refer any dispute arising out of this agreement to a conference of the four signatory powers joined by Italy. The four powers then went on to sign the First Washington Naval Conference in February 1922, which halted the building of any new capital ships for 10 years and laid down rules for the relative strength of the four navies. A ratio was established of 3 capital ships for Japan and 1.67 each for Italy and France to every 5 for Britain and the USA. In 1929, Britain, Japan, and the USA in the London Naval Treaty agreed to extend the main principle of this agreement to smaller fighting ships. The Chinese question. The USA hoped to create a new framework for international trade with China, which would reconcile the treaty port rights to the Western powers. With the rapid growth in Chinese nationalism in November, in 1921, the countries attending the Washington Conference agreed to respect the sovereignty, the independence, and territorial and administrative integrity of China, and in February 1922 signed the Nine-Power Treaty, which committed them to upholding the open door in China. Japan also agreed to evacuate all its troops from the Shandong Peninsula and to allow China the right to buy the former German railway lease, which Japan had acquired by the Treaty of Versailles. The decisions made at the Washington Conference improved Sino-Japanese relations during the 1920s, but made little progress in establishing China, which suffered from the growing conflict between the local warlords and was a source of international tension for the next 3 decades. The Genoa Conference, April 1922. By calling the Washington Conference in 1921, the USA had shown that it had the power to compel Britain, France, and Japan to agree to limiting the size of their navies. It also played a major role in attempts to stabilize the political and economic situation in China. However, it still followed a policy of non-involvement towards the acute international tensions in Europe. Consequently, in the absence of the USA, Lloyd George took the initiative in breaking the Franco-German deadlock over reparations and creating the conditions for European economic recovery. He believed that Germany needed a temporary moratorium on reparation payments to give it time to put its economy in order. In the longer term, the key to the payment of reparations in a European economic revival would lie in rebuilding the Russian economy through the formation of a European consortium, which would include Germany. This would generate an international trade boom, enable Germany to pay reparations, and reduce international tensions. Poincaré grudgingly consented to an international conference at Genoa, to which both the USSR and Germany would be invited to discuss these plans, but he vetoed any concession on reparations. The government of the USSR agreed to attend, but were highly suspicious of Lloyd George's plans for opening up their economy to foreign capital, which they feared was a subtle attempt to destroy Bolshevism. The Rapallo Pact. Suspicion of Lloyd George's motives promoted the USSR to secretly negotiate the Rapallo Agreement with Germany. During the conference, whereby both countries agreed to forego any financial claims against each other for damages they had suffered at each other's hand in the war, Germany also pledged to consult with Moscow before participating in any international plans for exploiting the Soviet economy. Rapallo led to the collapse of the Genoa Conference and effectively killed Lloyd George's plans for restoring the European economy. Why did Rathu sign the Rapallo Pact with the Russians? Poincaré's veto on the discussion of reparations was certainly a major cause, but the German government also feared that France and Britain were attempting to reestablish the pre-war Triple Entente with Russia. It is hard not to see Rapallo as a miscalculation by the Germans. While it helped Germany to escape from isolation, it did so at the cost of intensifying French suspicion of its motives and so increasing international tensions. In many ways, these suspicions were justified, as a secret annex signed in July allowed Germany to train its soldiers in Soviet territory, thereby violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Rapallo did not, of course, stop the USSR from supporting communist groups in Germany plotting to overthrow the German government. Lausanne Conference, November 1922 to July 1923. Of all the international conferences between 1920 and 1923, Lausanne was the most successful. Britain and France accepted the military and political realities of Kemal's success and realized that the Treaty of Sèvres was unenforceable. Turkish control of Anatolia and Thrace up the river of Marsia was recognized, and Kemal, anxious not to be dependent on Russia, agreed to the creation of small demilitarized zones on both sides of the straits and the freedom of navigation through them for Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. He also insisted on the abolition of the capitulations, which had given foreign states, particularly France, considerable power over Turkish finances and trading policy. This was a serious blow to the French hopes for reestablishing their pre-war influence over Turkish finances, and arguably they, apart from the Greeks, lost more than any other power as a consequence of the Treaty of Lausanne. Turkey's former Arab provinces remained under the control of Britain and France as League of Nations mandates, changing relations between the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, and the USA, and the USSR. 1920 to 1923. Britain and France up to 1922. Britain reluctantly supported France in its efforts to carry out the Treaty of Versailles, but with the collapse of the Genoa Conference, their differences over German reparations created major international tensions and brought the Entente to the verge of collapse. In the absence of a general inter-allied debt settlement, the French were determined to refuse any German requests for a moratorium unless they could occupy the Ruhr as a productive pledge. Consequently, in January 1923, French and Belgian troops advanced into the Ruhr, while Britain stood aside, powerless to influence events with its policy of benevolent passivity. Effectively, the Entente was at an end. Germany. In the early post-war post-war years. To quote the German historian Peter Kruger, writing in 1985, Germany was more an object of policy by the Entente rather than an independent country that could make its own decisions. German foreign policy was therefore swung between despairing opposition and more constructive attempts to modify Versailles. For Germany, given the U.S. reluctance to involve itself in European politics, there consequently appeared to be two main possibilities for achieving treaty revision. One was to exploit Anglo-French differences in the hope that this would weaken the united front of the Entente and lead to concessions to Germany by Britain. The other policy favored by the army, influential diplomats, and some industrialists was to come to an understanding with the USSR, which would strengthen Berlin's hand against the Entente. The Rapallo Treaty was the consequence of this policy, but a full alliance with the USSR was never practical politics for the German government, as the ultimate aim of the USSR was to create a communist Germany. The only power which could assist Germany was the USA by coming forward with a financial settlement that could break the reparation deadlock. It was thus to Washington that Germany and Britain looked during the Ruhr occupation. The United States. The USA emerged from the Great War as a major international force, yet it wasn't willing to accept a binding commitment to the League of Nations or to guarantee French security. However, that did not mean that it retreated into isolation. As the historian George Herring, 2008, said, it pursued a policy of involvement without commitment. It took the initiative in naval disarmament and was ready to help financial reconstruction in both Asia and Europe. As long as they did not harm U.S. interests, it insisted on the repayment of Allied war debts and protected its own trade through high tariffs, but was prepared to intervene during the Ruhr crisis with a proposal for setting up a committee of experts to work out a solution to the reparation crisis. The USSR, the new Soviet Russia that emerged from the Russian Revolution and subsequent civil war, had survived, to quote the historian Adam Tooze, 2014, only by the skin of its teeth. Although ideology it was a threat to Central and Western Europe, in reality it was only a shadow of the power it had been in 1914 or was to become in 1945. After its defeat by the Poles in 1920, it attempted to normalize its relations with the Baltic and Scandinavian states, Poland, Germany, Britain, and Turkey. It attended the Genoa Conference inside the Rapallo Pact with Germany, but the USSR never renounced its ultimate aim of world revolution, aimed at creating a communist world in which capitalism and imperialism would be destroyed forever. In September 1920, a Congress of the Peoples of the East was held at Baku, and a jihad declared against capitalism and imperialism. Through the Comintern, it was supported subversive activities in Germany, Western Europe, and the European colonial empires during the Ruhr crisis. Trotsky, as commissar for the armed forces, planned a series of uprisings in Germany, although only one poorly planned operation in Hamburg actually occurred. How successful were attempts to improve international relations from 1924 to 1929? 2.3. Economic recovery and the improvement in international relation. The Dawes Plan created a new and more optimistic climate in Europe and led to the French withdrawing from the Ruhr. Germany took measures to stabilize the mark, and its industrial production in 1927 reached the level of 1913. The inflow of U.S. financial investments became a crucial prop to the revived German economy. German economic recovery led to an improvement in international relations in the period 1925 to 1929 and opened the way to better relations between France and Germany. However, the recovery, particularly in Germany, was fragile and rested on the U.S. investment. If the flow of money stopped, Europe would again face an economic crisis with frightening political consequences. The aims and impacts of the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan played a crucial part in ending the bitter conflict over reparations, which had nearly escalated into open war during the Ruhr occupation. The aims of the Dawes Plan were to restore economic stability to post-war Europe. The recommendations of the Dawes Plan. The overall reparations total of 132 billion gold marks was not changed. It did recommend a loan to Germany of 800 million gold marks to be raised mainly in the USA. The amount of annual reparation payments was to start gradually and rise at the end of the 5 years to their maximum level. These payments were guaranteed by the reserves of the German railways and several other key industries. A committee of foreign experts sitting in Berlin under the chairmanship of a U.S. official was to ensure that the actual payments were transferred to Britain, France, and Belgium in such a way that the German economy was not damaged. The plan was provisional and was to be renegotiated over the next 10 years. The reaction to the Dawes Plan. While the British saw the Dawes Plan as a way to ending the escalating conflict between France and Germany, both France and Germany viewed it rather more skeptically. The British. It was welcomed enthusiastically in April 1924 by the British Treasury as the only constructive suggestion for escape from the present position, which, if left, must inevitably lead to war, open or concealed, between Germany and France. It also had the advantage of involving the USA in the whole process of extracting reparations from Germany. The French. There was much that the French government disliked about the plan. For instance, it was not clear to them how the Germans could be compelled to pay if they again defaulted and refused to pay, as they had in 1922. However, with the defeat of Poincarés in the elections of 1924, their willingness to cooperate markedly increased. Essentially, if the French were ever to receive any reparation payments and avoid isolation, they had little option but to go along with the Dawes Plan. The Germans. The German government also disliked the plan as it placed their railways and some of their industries under international control and did nothing about scaling down the reparation debts. Stresemann, who after the fall of his cabinet in November 1923 was now foreign minister in a new government, realized, however, that Germany had no alternative but to accept the plan if the French were to be persuaded to evacuate the Ruhr sooner rather than later. The London Conference. Agreement to implement the Dawes Plan and to withdraw French and Belgian forces from the Ruhr within 12 months was achieved at the London Conference in August 1924. The new balance of power in Europe was clearly revealed when Britain and the USA devised a formula for effectively blocking France's ability to act alone against Germany in the event of another default in reparation payments. If Germany again refused to pay, it would be agreed that Britain, as a member of the Reparation Commission, would have the right to appeal to the Permanent Court of International Justice at Hague. As a USA representative would immediately join the Reparation Commission. The joint Anglo-American pressure would then be more than enough to restrain France from reoccupying the Ruhr. Deprived of much of their influence on the Reparation Commission, the French had undoubtedly suffered as a major diplomatic defeat at the London Conference. The aims and impact of the Locarno Treaties, 1925. The Dawes Plan did not solve the problem of French security. Without any alliance with Britain, France was still left facing a potentially strong and aggressive Germany. Initially, therefore, the French had little option but to continue to insist on the literal implementation of the Treaty of Versailles. They refused, for instance, to agree to the evacuation of the Cologne zone, which was due in January 1925 on the grounds that Germany had not yet carried out the military clauses of the treaty, either in spirit or in the letter. The Locarno Negotiations, 1925. To reassure the French of Germany's peaceful intentions and so secure the evacuation of the Cologne, Stresemann, on the unofficial advice of the British ambassador in Berlin,
put forward a complex scheme for an international guarantee by the European great powers of the Rhineland and of the status quo in Western Europe. Austen Chamberlain, the British Foreign Secretary, at first suspected that the proposals of being an attempt to divide France and Britain. Then he grasped that it was an opportunity to achieve both French security and evacuation of the colony without committing Britain to a military pact with France, which the cabinet would never tolerate. Astrid Bryan, now back in power, was aware that only within the framework of an international agreement on the lines put forward by Stresemann could he in any way commit Britain to coming to the assistance of France if it were to be attacked by Britain. In the ensuing negotiations, Bryan successfully persuaded Chamberlain and Stresemann to widen the international guarantee to cover the Belgian-German frontier. He also attempted to extend it to Germany's eastern frontiers, but this was rejected by both Stresemann and Chamberlain. However, Stresemann did undertake to refer disputes with Poland and Czechoslovakia to arbitration, although he refused to recognize their frontiers with Germany as permanent. Chamberlain was quite specific that it was in Britain's interest only to guarantee the status quo in Western Europe. He told the House of Commons in November 1925 in words that were to return to haunt the British government that extending the guarantee to the Polish corridor would not be worth the bones of a British grandier. The negotiations were completed at the Locarno Conference from October 5th to 16th, 1925, and 7 treaties were signed on December 1st. The most important of these were agreements confirming the inviolability of the Franco-German and Belgian-German frontiers, i.e. the borders would not be changed, and the demilitarized of the Rhineland. The treaties were underwritten by an Anglo-Italian guarantee. If a relatively minor incident on one of the frontiers covered by the Locarno occurred, the injured party would first appeal to the Council of the League of Nations, and if the complaint was upheld, the guarantors would assist the injured state to secure compensation from the aggressor. In the event of a serious violation of the treaty, the guarantors could act immediately, although they would still eventually refer the issue to the Council of the League. The Locarno Treaties and the improvement in international relations. Throughout Western Europe and the USA, the Locarno Treaties were greeted with enormous enthusiasm and optimism, which was characterized by the Locarno spirit. It appeared as if real peace had at last come. Had France now achieved the security it had so long been seeking? Of all the great powers, the French gained the least from Locarno. It is true that France's eastern frontier was now secure, but under Locarno, it could no longer threaten to occupy the Ruhr in order to bring pressure to bear on Berlin in the event of Germany breaking the Treaty of Versailles. The British had managed to give France the illusion of security, but the provision for referring all but major violations of the Locarno Treaty to the League before taking action ensured that the British government would in practice be able to determine through its own representative on the Council what action, if any, it should take. For Britain, there were 2 main advantages to Locarno. It tied France down and prevented it from repeating the Ruhr occupation, also by improving relations between Germany and the Western powers, and by holding out the prospect of German membership of the League. It discouraged any close cooperation between Moscow and Berlin. Locarno was deeply unpopular with German nationalists, but for Stresemann it was the key to the gradual process of revising the Treaty of Versailles. Changing relations between Britain and France. Germany, the USA, and USSR, 1924 to 1925. The Locarno Pact led to a dramatic improvement in Anglo-French-German relations. Britain, France, and Germany agreed that Locarno involved goodwill and concessions, yet the scope and timing of these concessions were a matter of constant and often bitter debate. Both Stresemann and Bryan had to convince their countrymen that their Locarno policy was working. Bryan had to show that he was not giving too much away, while Stresemann had to satisfy German public opinion that his policy of fulfillment was resulting in real concessions from the ex-allies. It can be argued that the survival not only of Stresemann's policy, but of the German Republic itself, depended on whether more ambitious diplomatic success. Russia, Germany, and Britain. The Soviet government, which after the death of Lenin in January 1924, increasingly fell under the control of Stalin, viewed the progress made in establishing Western Europe through the Dawes Plan and the Locarno Agreements with both dismay and hostility, as it feared that would strengthen the anti-Bolshevik forces in Europe and delay revolution in Germany. The Russians initially attempted to deflect Stresemann from his Locarno policy, first with the offer of a military alliance against Poland, and then, when that didn't work, with the contradictory threat of joining with France to guarantee Poland's western frontiers. Stresemann, aware of Russia's attempts to stir up revolution in Germany in 1923, was not ready to abandon the Locarno policy, but he was anxious to keep open his links with Moscow and consolidate the Rapallo Agreement of 1922, if only as a possible insurance against Anglo-French pressure in the West. Thus, Russia was able first to negotiate a commercial treaty with Germany in October 1925. Then in April 1926, at a time when Poland and France were trying to delay Germany's membership of the League Council, they persuaded Stresemann to sign the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, the Berlin Treaty. Essentially, this was a neutrality pact in which both powers agreed to remain neutral if either party was attacked by a third power. Anglo-Russian relations. Relations between Russia and Britain sharply deteriorated when a conservative government was elected in October 1924. The outgoing Labour government had just negotiated the Anglo-Soviet General Treaty, which was an agreement of Anglo-Soviet trade and the settlement of pre-war debts. The conservatives, however, suspicious of attempts by the USSR to stir up revolution in the UK, as revealed by the Zinviao letter, refused to ratify it. 3 years later, after ordering a raid on the offices of the official Soviet trading company, AICE, in an attempt to discover evidence of espionage, the British government severed all official relations with Russia. Only in 1929, with the return of Labour, were ambassadors again exchanged. This outbreak of the First Anglo-Soviet Cold War, as the American historian Jacobson called it, strengthened Stalin's government determination to cut Russia off from the West. Increasingly, the main thrust of Soviet foreign policy in the late 1920s was to exploit anti-Western feeling in the Middle East, China, and India. Anglo-French concessions to Germany in 1925 to 1927. The atmosphere of détente created by Locarno quickly led to the evacuation of the Cologne zone in 1926. And in September 1926, Germany at last joined the League of Nations and received a permanent seat on the council. Stresemann did, however, manage to extract further concessions from both Britain and France. In 1927, the remaining Inter-Allied Disarmament Commission was withdrawn from Germany, and in the following August, Britain, France, and Belgium withdrew a further 10,000 troops from their Grantions in the Rhineland. The USA and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. In June 1927, Bryan wrote an open letter to the American people proposing a bilateral treaty outlawing war. He hoped that this would strengthen French ties with the USA and strengthen France in relation to Germany. Initially, the USA ignored the proposal, but the American peace movement organized a massive campaign to have war outlawed. In reaction to this, Frank B. Kellogg, the U.S. Secretary of State, suggested a general pact between as many states as possible, rejecting war as an instrument of national policy. This did not please Bryan at all, as it would have opened up the pact to German membership. For that very reason, the Germans enthusiastically accepted Kellogg's proposal. In a mirror image to the original French intentions, they hoped that it would improve U.S.-German relations and led to the U.S. revising the Dawes Plan. They also believed that a multilateral peace pact would make it more difficult for the French to build an anti-German alliance in the future. Consequently, in the complex negotiations that led to the signing of the pact on August 27, 1928, the German foreign officers used all its skills in support of the project, while the French raised difficulty after difficulty. Britain was happy to join the pact, believing that it would, by protecting the status quo, help preserve the British Empire. Optimists say the pact as the pact as supplementing the convent of the League. It outlawed war while the League had the necessary machinery for setting up commissions of inquiry and implementing cooling off periods in the event of a dispute. Pessimists stressed that it was just a general declaration of intention which did not commit its members and would certainly not stop war. The Young Plan and the evacuation of the Rhineland. 2 years later, Stresemann achieved his greatest success when he managed to secure agreement from Britain and France to agree to a permanent reduction in reparations in an Anglo-French evacuation of the Rhineland, 5 years before the Treaty of Versailles required it. In February 1929, under the chairmanship of the American Owen D. Young, talks on a new reparation settlement opened in Paris. Young gained President Hoover's support to reduce the reparation Germany had to pay from $132 billion to $112 billion over a period of 59 years, and to set up a bank for international settlements, which Young described as the economic arm of the Kellogg Pact. At the Hague Conference in 1929, the Young Plan was accepted by Britain, France, and Germany, and Britain and France also agreed to evacuate the Rhineland in 1930. The agreement to end the Rhineland occupation helped to make the Young Plan acceptable in Germany, but even so, in December, the government faced a referendum forced on them by the Nazi and nationalist parties, declaring that its signature would be an act of high treason on the grounds that Germany was still committed to paying reparations. This was easily defeated, and the Young Plan was officially implemented on January 20th, 1930. Given continued U.S. loans and German economic growth, it might have been successful and decisively improved international relations, but the Great Depression made it unworkable. How successful was the League of Nations during the 1920s? 2.4. The League was a part of the International Settlements Negotiation 1919 to 1920, and its ultimate success or failure was dependent on the progress made by the great powers in establishing Europe after the First World War. Not surprisingly, the League's golden age coincided with the temporary stability created by the Locarno era. Aims, membership, and the structure of the League. The League was ultimately dependent on its members to enforce its aims. It had no armed forces in 1920. It was also handicapped in its work by the absence of three great powers, the USA, Germany, and the USSR. Aims. The aims of the League were clearly stated in the Covenant of the League of Nations, which formed the first part of each of the peace treaties. The heart of the Covenant, Articles 8 through 17, was primarily concerned with the overriding question of the prevention of war. The League's long-term strategy for creating a peaceful world was summed up in the first section of Article 8. The members of the League recognized that the maintenance of peace requires the reduction of national armaments to the lowest point consistent with national safety, and the enforcement by common action of international obligations. The process for solving disputes between sovereign powers was defined in Articles 12 through 17. Initially, Article 12, disputes were to be submitted to some form of arbitration or inquiry by the League. While this was happening, there was to be a cooling off period of 3 months. By Article 13, members were committed to carrying out the judgment of the Permanent Court of International Justice, or the recommendations of the Council. Even if a dispute was not submitted to arbitration, the Council was empowered by Article 15 to set up an inquiry into its origins. The assumption in these articles was that states would be only too willing to eliminate war by making use of the League's arbitration machinery. If, however, a state ignored the League's recommendations, Article 16 made it clear that in Article 17, the League's powers were significantly extended by its right to intervene in disputes between non-members of the League, while in Article 11, member states were encouraged to refer to the Assembly or Council any international problems which might threaten the peace. In theory, the League seemed to have formidable powers, but it was not a world government in the making. With powers to coerce independent nations, its existence was based on Article 10 made clear, on the recognition of the political and territorial independence of all member states. Article 15, for instance, recognized that if a dispute arose from an internal issue, the League had no right to intervene. There were two several gaps in the League covenant which allowed a potential aggressor to wage war without sanction. War had to be officially declared before the League could act effectively. It had, for instance, no formula for dealing with acts of guerrilla warfare which the instigating state could disown. Even in the event of a formal declaration of war, if the International Court or the Council could not agree on a verdict, the League members were free to continue with their war membership. The initial members of the League were the 32 Allied states which had signed the peace treaties and 13 neutral states. Any other state could be admitted to membership by a 2/3 majority vote of the Assembly by 1926. All the former enemy states, including Germany, had joined, but Soviet Russia did not do so until 1934, and the USA never did. Structure. The League at first consisted of three main organs: the Assembly, the Council, and the Permanent Secretariat. The Assembly. The Assembly was essentially a deliberative chamber where each state, regardless of its size, was allotted 3 representatives. It was a jealousy guarded principle that even the smallest state had the right to be heard on international issues. The Council. The Council in 1920 had 4 permanent members: Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. In 1926, this was increased by 1 when Germany joined. The smaller states were represented by a changing rota of 4 temporary members, later increased to 7, who were all selected by the Assembly. As the Council met more frequently than the Assembly and was dominated by the great powers, it gradually developed as an executive committee or cabinet of the Assembly and worked out the details and implementation of policies which the Assembly had endorsed in principle. Decisions in both bodies were normally taken by unanimous vote. The votes of states involved in the dispute under discussion by the Leagues were discounted when the Assembly and Council voted on recommendations for its settlement. In this way, they could be prevented from vetoing an otherwise unanimous decision. Permanent Secretariat. The routine administrative work of the League and its agencies was carried out by the Permanent Secretariat, which was staffed by a relatively small international civil service. Permanent Court of International Justice. In 1921, a 4th organ was added to the League when the Permanent Court of International Justice was set up at the Hague in the Netherlands, with the task of both advising the Council on legal matters and judging cases submitted to it by individual states. Collective security and the League's involvement in the resolution of disputes. Until 1926, when the foreign ministers of Britain, France, and Germany began to attend the meetings of the Council and turn it into a body which regularly discussed the main problems of the day, the League of Nations' role in the many post-war crises were subordinated to the Allied leaders and the Conference of Ambassadors, which had set up to supervise the carrying out of the Treaty of Versailles. For the most part, it therefore dealt with minor crises only. In 1920, the inability of the League to act successfully without the backing of the great powers was clearly demonstrated when it failed to protect Armenia from a joint Russo-Turkish attack, as neither Britain, France, nor Italy was ready to protect it with force. One of the French delegates cautiously observed it in the Assembly that he and his colleagues were in the ridiculous position of an assembly which considers what steps should be taken, though it is perfectly aware that it is impossible for them to be carried out. Polish-Lithuanian quarrel over Vilna. In October 1920, in response to appeals from the Polish foreign minister, the League negotiated an armistice between Poland and Lithuania, whose quarrel over border territories was rapidly escalating into war. The ceasefire did not, however, hold, as shortly afterwards General Z, with a Polish force with the Warsaw government diplomatically presented, was acting on its own initiative, occupied the city of Vilna and set up the new puppet government of Central Lithuania under its protection. The League first called for a plebiscite and then, when this was rejected, attempted in vain to negotiate a compromise settlement. In March 1922, Poland finally annexed Vilna province a year later, after it was obvious that the League could not impose a solution without the support of the great powers. The Conference of Ambassadors took the matter into its own hands and recognized Polish sovereignty over Vienna. Britain, France, and Italy, by failing to use the machinery of the League to stop Polish aggression, had again effectively marginalized it. The Åland Islands dispute. In less stubborn disputes, however, where the states involved were willing to accept a verdict, the League did have an important and successful role to play as mediator. The League enjoyed a rare success in the dispute between Finland and Sweden over the Åland Islands. These had belonged to the Grand Duchy of Finland when it had been part of the Russian Empire. Once Finland had broken away from Russia in 1917, the islanders, who were ethnically Swedish, appealed to the Stockholm to take over the islands. When Sweden began to threaten to use force, the British referred the matter to the League. In 1921, the League supported the status quo by leaving the islands under Finnish sovereignty, but insisted on itself ensuring the civil rights of the Swedish population there. Neither government liked the verdict, but both accepted it, and what is more important, made it work. Albania, Upper Silesia, and Memel. In the second half of the 1921, the League did serve as useful means of focusing the attention of the great powers on the plight of Albania when it urgently appealed for help against Greek and Yugoslav aggression, as the Conference of Ambassadors had not yet finally fixed its frontiers. The Greeks and Yugoslavs were exploiting the ambiguous situation to occupy as much Albanian territory as they could. The Council responded by dispatching a commission of inquiry, but it took a telegram from Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, both to galvanize the Conference of Ambassadors into finalizing the frontiers and to push the League Council into threatening economic sanctions against Yugoslavia if it did not recognize them. When this was successful, the League was then entrusted with supervising the Yugoslav withdrawal. Thus, in the crisis, the League had played a useful but, again, secondary role to the Allied powers. The fact that the Conference of Ambassadors then made Italy the protector of Albania independence indicates where the real power lay. In August 1921, the League played a key role in solving the bitter Anglo-French dispute over the Upper Silesia plebiscite, which was referred to the League Council. It again proved useful to the protected dispute over Memel. With the Lithuanians objected to the decisions by the Conference of Ambassadors to internalize the port of Memel and seize the port themselves in 1923, the League was the obvious body to sort out the problem. Its decision for Lithuania was accepted by Britain and France. Attempts by Britain and Sweden to refer the question of the Ruhr occupation of 1923 to the League were blocked by the French, who had no intention of allowing the League to mediate between themselves and the Germans. Mosul and the Greco-Bulgarian dispute. In 1923, the League was confronted with another crisis involving a greater power and a lesser power. On this occasion, it was able to mediate successfully. It provided a face-saving means of retreat for Turkey in its dispute with Britain over the future of Mosul, which, according to the Treaty of Lausanne, was to be decided by direct Anglo-Turkish negotiations. When these talks broke down and the British issued in October 1924 an ultimatum to Turkey to withdraw its forces within 48 hours, the League intervened and recommended a temporary demarcation lines between the Turkish forces, which the Turkish forces withdrew, and then sent a commission of inquiry to consult the local Kurdish population, which, as total independence was not an option, preferred British to Turkish rule. The League's recommendation that Mosul should become a mandate of Iraq for 25 years was then accepted. As Iraq was a British mandate, this effectively put it under British control. In October 1925, the League's handling of the Greco-Bulgarian conflict, like its solution to the island disputes, was to be a rare example of a complete success, where the Bulgarians appealed to the court. Its request for a ceasefire was heeded immediately by both sides. So too was the verdict of its commission of inquiry, which found in favor of Bulgaria. It was an impressive example of what the League could do, and in the autumn of 1925, this success, together with the new Locarno spirit, seemed to promise well for the future. Bryan was able to claim at the meeting of the Council in October 1925 that a nation which appealed to the League when it felt that its existence was threatened could be sure that the Council would be at its post ready to undertake its work of coalition. The League was not put to the test again until the Manchurian crisis of 1931. Unfortunately, Bryan's optimism was then shown to be premature. The League could function well only if the great powers were in agreement. Weakness of the League. The League was a new experiment in the international cooperation which coexisted uneasily with the traditional system of sovereign states. Its main weakness included the following. The League was tied into the peace settlements and often appeared to be answerable to the Conference of Ambassadors. It was, for example, responsible for the administration of the Tsar, Dazing, which inevitably involved it becoming too close associated with the policies of the Allies. It suffered from the absence of the USA, and until 1926 and 1934, Germany and the USSR, respectively. The Corfu incident, like the Ruhr crisis, underlined the continuing self-interest of the major powers, and their ability to ignore the League and to take unilateral action when it pleased them. This ensured that it was difficult to achieve unanimity in support of a particular policy. Given the economic problems many states faced, they were both unwilling and unable to give the League any support in the event of a crisis which might result in war against an aggressor. The League's covenant provided too many loopholes for war, supported the status quo which favored the great powers, and, in the final analysis, lacked the machinery for collective action against an aggressor. In other words, it lacked an army. Yet, even if it had a theoretically perfect constitution, would its history have been any different? Ultimately, it was a product of the times and could only do what its members wished. Role and impact of the agencies. In 1945, it was clear that the League had failed in its central task of peace, but many people felt that its work in improving economic, social, and health environments had been successful. The mandates. Article 22 of the Covenants marked a potential revolutionary new concept in international affairs. When the Allies distributed the former German and Turkish territories among themselves, they were divided into three groups according to how developed they were. The view was that the most developed were in the Middle East, while the least developed were the former German islands in the Pacific. The League's greatest task was to avoid the mandates being treated as colonies by the powers in temporary charge of them. Thus, mandate powers were required to send in annual reports of their territories to the League's Permanent Mandates Commission, which rapidly gained a formidable reputation for its expertise and authority. The League's attitude toward the mandates was, by modern standards, patriotistic and condescending, but nevertheless, as the historian F.S. Northedge had argued, it helped transform the entire climate of colonialism, since the imperialist powers were forced by moral pressure to consider the interests of the native populations and to begin to contemplate the possibility that they would one day become independent. Rights of minorities. The League was also the guarantor of the agreements signed by the Allies and the successor states created in 1919, which were aimed by ensuring that minority communities felt less isolated behind the new frontiers, enjoyed full civil rights. By 1922, it was responsible for guaranteeing minority rights in Austria, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. How effective was it in carrying out this task? Pensions from minority communities were considered by standing committees and sometimes referred to the Council of the League. but the League had no means of enforcing minority rights except through what the historian P.A. Reynolds calls the pressure of persuasion of publicity. Italy, for example, ignored the League when dealing with its German minority, and in 1934 Poland refused the right of the League Council to interfere in minority matters. The League's welfare, medical, and economic work. The League was excluded from dealing with the key financial issues of reparations and war debts, but nevertheless in 1922 its financial committee was entrusted by the Allied leaders with the task of rebuilding first Austria and then Hungary's economy. Its economic committee had the far greater task of attempting to persuade the powers to abolish protection and create a worldwide free trade zone. It organized two World Economic Conferences held in 1927 and 1933, which both the USSR and the USA attended, but not surprisingly, given the strongly protectionist economic climate of the times, which was caused by the Great Depression, it failed to make any progress towards free trade. The International Labor Organization. One of the greatest success of the League of Nations was the International Labor Organization, ILO. This had originally been created as an independent organization by the Treaty of Versailles, but it was financed by the League in some ways. It was the League in miniature. It had its own permanent labor office at Geneva, staffed by 1,000 officials. Its work was discussed annually by a conference of labor delegates. Right up until 1939, the ILO turned out an impressive stream of reports, recommendations, and statistics which provided important information for a wide range of industries all over the world. There were reports and recommendations for regulating the work of workers in the fishing industry, labor conditions on ships, minimum wage, fixing machinery, coal miners. Not all of this was put into effect by the member states, but the recommendations of the League set standards and assisted the trade unions in improving the working conditions of workers. These reports were, for example, appreciated by the USA, which, despite not being a member of the League, joined the ILO, and even Germany and Japan remained members of the ILO after withdrawing from the League. Health Organization. The League's health organization provided an invaluable forum for drawing up common policies on such matters as the treatment of diseases such as leprosy and malaria, and the design of hospitals and health education. The League also set up committees to advise on limiting the production of opium and other addictive drugs, on the outlawing of the sale of women and children for prostitution, and on the effective abolition of slavery.